Hi, this is Mr. Millay, and this is your video review for AP United States History. Some of the things you'll need to know are, what were some of the arguments that people made against slavery, and what were some of the arguments people made that said they should be allowed to have slavery, some of the arguments of slaveholders and things like that. Other things you need to know about why it was called King Cotton, and I'm not going to ask you to know all of the percentages, but you need to know that the South grew a whole lot of the world's supply of cotton, about 75%, as you'll remember. All right. You need to know about how much they traded with Great Britain and how much England was dependent on our cotton. We talked about the three different Souths. I'm not going to ask you to go into percentages, but know the differences. You know, the border South had a lot less slaves and a lot more free black people. The Middle South was kind of like a mix between the Upper and Lower South, and then the Deep South or the Lower South had the biggest, most severe slavery, most percentages of slavery, and grew 95% of the cotton. All right, and remember, even in the worst of or where the slavery was the most, they did not have a large majority of people on or owning slaves. You need to know what the peculiar institution was, why it was called that, who came up with it. You need to know what the plantation system was and why it required so many slaves. You need to know how the cotton gin affected slavery and why it increased slavery rather than decreasing it like they thought it might. You need to know the fact that the United States slave population was one of the very few that perpetuated itself based on reproduction instead of the slave trade. Because even when the slave trade was made illegal, they still did it. Slave cost about $1,200. Need to know that. Need to know what the effects of slavery were, how it made people react, how it made people feel. You need to know about the slave revolts. I'm not going to ask you about all of them. I'm definitely going to ask you about Gabriel Prosser. You know, who would have been a huge military result, but he got turned in by one of those slaves. And I need you to know definitely about Nat Turner's revolt, probably the most successful, in that a lot of people died, but it did not help the slaves' lives. And what happened as a result of slavery in a lot of these places? I need you to make sure that you know, what were the results of the slave trade? What were the results of these slave revolts? All right. You need to know what it was like to be what they called a mulatto, which would be a mixed white and black, and what it was like to be a free black living in the United States at the time. We talked about that in class. You definitely you need to know. Well, if I can get it to pull up, darn it. There we go. Sorry. You need to know what it was like in the North, discrimination, especially amongst the Irish, and why the Irish did not think much of slaves and of blacks. You need to know what abolitionism meant and the colony in Liberia that was created to help the slaves, or to house freed slaves. And so there's that. You need to know about some of the abolitionists that we talked about, radical abolitionism. Wendell Phillips, who wrote a lot of good literature about abolition. You need to know about David Walker. He was the one that said that slaves should be revolt bloodily. And you need to know about Frederick Douglass, probably the most important. He was a black abolitionist. He was free. He was a slave and then ran away, wrote books trying to end the struggle. And people didn't like these guys because they proved that, blacks could maybe be worth something. And they didn't want to believe that in the South. You need to know about what about what the pro-slavery whites said, things about how the master-slave relationship was like family, and that at least slaves were cared for their entire lives, not like the wage slaves in the North. And then finally, if you talk about the abolitionist impact in the North and how it influenced people, then if you do all those things, then you'll be good on the slavery portion, and I'll do another video review in just a little bit with some other information.